Hey, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and this is video number 6 in my Westchester Dolman top video sew-along. In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to prep and attach the sleeve bands to the ends of our sleeves so we can finish them off, and then also how to hem the top. I'm going to share with you my tips, tricks, and really cool techniques, including a stitch that you probably have on your sewing machine that you never thought to use for hemming your stretch knits. So let's get right to it. Let's move this over, grab your 2 sleeve bands, and to prep these guys, line them up here. You're going to fold it so that the short ends touch each other and the pretty side of the fabric should be face up. So I'm going to come in here, grab my ballpoint pins again, and I'm just going to put 1 or 2 pins on this short edge. That's the first seam that we're going to sew. And since you have 2 to do, go ahead and prep the other one the same way. Now we'll head over to the sewing machine and we are stitching just on these 2 short sides to make it into basically one round loop of fabric. Now remember that all the seam allowances for the entire project are 1/2 inch. So you're still going to keep the same needle, same thread, same seam allowance, same stitch that you've used to put together the front and the back of the top. So the same thing, nothing else has changed, just 1 there and 1 seam there. All right, so I've changed out the thread to navy thread because I think it shows up better here. Now let me go into my menu and select my stretch stitch. So it just depends on your machine. All right. Give these a quick press with some steam. I also like to hit it with my clapper. Then we're going to open up the seam and press it again to distribute the bulk of fabric in the seam allowance here. Okay, so now you have a band, but you're now going to fold this in half this way to basically bring together the 2 raw edges. So I'm at the seam that we just sewed. I'm going to pinch it there. Do you see now how I've brought the wrong sides of the fabric together along the seam and the entire way around? So you're folding it in half in the round. Bring up the raw edge to meet the others. Up here, and just work your hand around it, and then we'll press it and set it with the clapper again to keep that fold right where we want it. So this is how the band should be, and you're going to stitch it along here. So you're going to have this at the bottom. What would be kind of the hem of your sleeve is going to be a nice folded, just finished edge. So this is a lot easier, I think, for beginners than doing an actual hem with a cover stitch or a twin needle or something like that. So now I'm going to press it. And you can see how that clapper, it just creates the best creases in anything that you need. So I'll repeat the same thing to this one. Now we're going to pin the sleeve band to the actual sleeve. Now here's one point that can be a little bit tricky if you're not thinking ahead. You end up sewing it and then you'll see the seam on the outside of your sleeve. Instead, because there's only 1 seam here where we put the loop together, you'll see just the 1 seam you sewed. Everything else is smooth fabric with no other seams. So what I like to do is to put the seam on the inside part of the sleeve so that when you're looking at the top as you're wearing it, all this edge of the finished sleeve is completely smooth and there are no seams on the exterior part. So to do that, find the seam that you just sewed, and mine is right here. And I have my top oriented here with the sleeve in the correct way that you're going to be wearing it. So I know that this will be the top of my arm, okay, this part of the fabric. There is a seam on the shirt sleeve, but you don't want it, I mean, you can have it, it's not a big deal, but this is just the way I like to do it to conceal the seam a little bit better. This seam on the band needs to match up with the bottom one. Not this guy, this one. So what I do is I open up the sleeve and find that seam that's going to be there. And notice that both my top and my sleeve band are with the pretty sides out and exposed. Okay, so make sure that you have every step of this oriented correctly so that you can get the proper installation of the sleeve band before you sew and you don't have to pull out stitches then. So this seam here, I'm going to find my seam on the sleeve band. I insert my hand in the sleeve band and I grab the sleeve of my top and I'm going to pull it in here. Then from the inside, I'm going to find the seam on my sleeve and match it up with the seam on my sleeve band. That's the first place I match everything up. Grab your ballpoint pins and insert a pin right there to hold that spot. Then you kind of walk around the rest of the sleeve and you'll see that the sleeve is going to have to, the sleeve band will be stretched slightly to get it to fit. So when you have a fabric that's really stretchy like this, I don't bother to quarter the sleeve bands, and I think it just oftentimes confuses beginners because it gets to the point where there's so many steps to keep track of. So if you match this intersection here, then with both of your thumbs, just kind of stretch this out like this, and wherever that sleeve band is going to be on the other side, just put yourself another pin right there. And those are the only two spots that I really pin for the sleeve band, okay? And you just want to make sure that you stitch a little, you stop, and you make sure that you're lining up all these raw edges. You should have 2 raw edges from the sleeve band and 1 from the sleeve of the actual shirt. So that's it. You're going to stitch it like that, and then this gets flipped back out so the seam allowance gets tucked inside the shirt and you get a nice clean finish. So I will repeat that to the other side, and I won't skip this part so you see it. Here's the front of my top. I'm coming over to the other side. This is the top seam. The bottom seam is the one I want to match up with the seam on my sleeve band. So again, come in like this, slip the sleeve inside, and then get that center or that bottom seam on the sleeve and match it up with the seam on my sleeve band. Pin there. Match up raw edges. Give it a little tug to see where I end up on the other side. Everything will fit right there, like that. And I'm going to grab it here and put another pin. And that's it. We're going to head back to the sewing machine. Remember, same needle, same thread, same seam allowance, same stitch. Everything is the same, okay? And we're going to stitch right in the round, and I'll show you how to set that up on the machine because some of you may be wondering how exactly you're going to stitch something this tight, small, and circular in your sewing machine. So either to hem a sleeve or to stitch on a sleeve band when it's a tight, small space like that, it depends on your machine. Some machines will have a really narrow free arm that you can drape this over. So I've removed the accessory bin from my machine, and I find for my size, it happens to just fit over the free arm of my machine perfectly enough to keep my sleeve band taut, and it's really easy for me to go and do it. However, if you don't have a free arm that you can expose on your sewing machine, or maybe your machine is set in a cabinet, then you won't be able to take anything off of here. And if you can't, obviously this is not going to fit or stretch enough to get it over the whole thing. So what I do is I stitch from the inside. So keep this portion away from you, lift your presser foot, and then you would start stitching like that from the inside of the opening itself. So I'm making sure that all 3 of my raw edges are lined up nicely. I haven't changed any settings on my machine, and I'm just going to start stitching. Depending on the fabric that you're using for the band, you'll find that you'll have to stretch it some. If you're stretching the band, do not stretch the sleeve because you don't want everything to just bow out on you. You want the sleeve band to kind of cinch it in a little bit more at the sleeve. So this is the sleeve of the shirt, and the doubled up one is my band. So notice I'm not pulling on this guy, I'm just lining it up straight, but I'm giving it a little tug on the bottom 2 layers, which is my sleeve band. And you just do an inch or so, kind of turn everything around, give yourself a little bit more slack, and just work your way around the circle here. And right here, it looks like I don't have to stretch much anymore. I have a little bit of bagging there in the sleeve, meaning I need to tug on my sleeve band just a little to get it to stretch and reach. Now I'm coming around to the end. There's no bubbling in the sleeve fabric, so I know that I've stretched enough. I don't have to really stretch anymore. The sleeve band, that is. Make sure all my edges are close and lined up there. Now when I come around to where I first started with my stitches, I'm just going to stitch over them a little bit so I don't have to back stitch. Because it's a narrow zigzag, it basically will lock itself in place instead of a straight stitch where you'd want to come over a little bit and maybe take a back stitch or two. Okay, nice and stretchy, no stitches popping, and this is how it's going to look. That's the outside, so there's no seam matching this seam that came off of the shoulder into the sleeve band. And then the bottom one here goes that way, okay? Now for the other sleeve band, I'm gonna do it using the free arm so you can see both techniques and options that you have, depending on your sewing machine and setup. Make sure I have all my layers. Stitch a little, pull a little in the round, make sure everything is lined up, and continue. All right, so now we press. Make sure we got some steam going in this iron. You see how it's bubbled up like that? And this is super flat. This is where the clapper really comes in handy. All right, so the sleeves are finished. They look good to me. Do the other one. So here's what we have so far. So if you notice, we've already sewn in 4 of our pattern pieces. The only one that we have left is the neckband. And personally, I just leave this till the end because it makes me slow down and be a little bit more precise. There, again, are different steps to putting this together, but I'm just walking you through how I do it. So what I'm going to do next is hem the top. So at this point, you can put it on and see if you like the length or not, if you need to cut some off, if you need to do a really narrow hem because you don't want to eat up too much of the length that you currently have. So I'm going to go ahead and put this top on and show you how it looks. I'll kind of look at myself in the mirror and see the length and determine how wide I want to make my hem. All right, so based on where that hits me, it practically covers all of my butt, even with jeans on top. So it still stretches nicely, and it's about as fitted as I like to wear my tops, even over pants. So that's great. So for me, I could still stand to lose a whole inch. And personally, I really like the look of 1-inch hems on knit tops. It just looks really clean and finished versus having a really narrow little teensy hem. I'm going to flip this top wrong side out. And we're going to fold up towards the wrong side this way, the bottom hem 1 inch. Now to use this as a guide, there's a lot of different things that you can use. What I prefer to use is a little seam guide that I create from manila folders. And I have a video tutorial on how to do this, so I'll link it to you here and also in the description box below so you can easily make one. It's just a chunk of manila folder, and I draw lines with my ruler in 1/4 inch increments. So this is 1/4 inch, half, 3/4, and this top line here is my 1 inch line. So what you want to do is place it a little bit in, and you're going to fold that bottom edge until the raw edge hits the 1 inch guide. Making sure that the manila folder is all the way pushed into the fold of the fabric. And you're just going to do this and work it in small increments and press with your clapper. When you remove the manila folder, you will see that with the clapper and the help of that steam, look how that clapper makes that really, really nice and pronounced crease in the fabric. All right? So I'm turning the fabric under 1 inch, which means that when I stitch from the front side of the fabric, to hold that hem in place, I can't stitch at the same 1 inch because I'll be like right on the edge of where the fabric is. So I'll stitch at about 3/4 of an inch, maybe a little less than 7/8. And so if you want the stitching to be 1 inch up from the bottom, then this little fold part here of the hem needs to be a little bit more. And you'll see that when we get to the point of stitching, so that way you can anticipate it for when you go to make your top or you make another garment. And the hem is really, a lot of it is personal preference on how you finish the garment. Based on what you have, how much of the garment you want to shorten or not. A smaller hem would still look fine. When you get to the side seams, I open them to evenly distribute the bulk. That clapper makes all the difference in having that really sharp crease right there, so that when you stitch it from the front, I mean, look at the bottom hemline. It's going to be so perfect. And without a sharp crease there, a nice flat set fabric, you won't get that look. It'll be more of like a bubbled, rolled look. And sometimes when you stitch it, it will tend to move and kind of get a little distorted on you. So this is a really, it takes a little bit more time, a couple minutes, not too much. And it might be a little fidgety if this is your first time doing this type of a hem, but it's totally worth it. So here's something else that I find. When you set your hem with the clapper, I don't even bother to put pins. So although this part might take me a few minutes to do, it really saves me time on the pinning end, because I can just easily, when you open it up, you still have that nice crease. So even if the fabric opens up like this, when I'm at the sewing machine, I can just fold it up to where it has what we call a memory hem, because the fabric remembers where I creased it, and I can just continue to stitch it nicely from the front side of the fabric. So let's give it a little press just in any other spots that you find that maybe didn't get set as well. And let's head over to the sewing machine. All right, so now we're ready to stitch down our hem. And to do that, I'm going to share with you all one of my most favorite stitches to use when I'm finishing stretch knit specifically. Now we know that if we use a straight stitch on something that's going to get a lot of stretch in it, it's going to pop the stitches, right? So what I'm going to do is teach you something else. On my machine, it's the number 9 stitch, and it's called a triple straight stitch. It's not going to pop like you would think a straight stitch would, and I think you're going to be quite impressed to get a nice kind of professional finish look at the bottom hem of your top, and it's still going to maintain the stretch that's already built in to the fabric. Now I have changed my thread back to white because the fabric is a little dark, and that will allow it to show up better for you to see on camera. For you, of course, you know, you can use whatever coordinating thread you're going to be using. So now we have to find a guide on our throat plate here, or maybe it's some type of a separate seam guide that you use on your machine, to determine how far over from the bottom folded and creased edge that we created at the hemline we're going to be stitching. So for me, remember, my folded fabric is folded 1 inch over. So I cannot stitch at 1 inch because I'm going to miss the edge. So you basically want to determine how far over from the fold you're going to stitch so that it catches it but high up here, so you don't really have to go back in and trim any excess fabric from the inside. So for me, that's going to be about 3/4 of an inch. And you can even feel, if you're using a lightweight fabric, you can feel through here where the folded fabric is underneath, and I can tell it's right there. I'm going to line it up on this line on the bed of my sewing machine. And I know that I just need to focus on running the folded creased hemline along that same edge the whole way through, and I will be fine. So I'm selecting my triple straight stitch. The stitch length on my triple straight stitch on this machine, the default is set to 2.5. I'm going to lengthen it to a 3.0 millimeter length because that's just what I prefer. Again, a lot of this is personal preference, so go ahead and use a scrap piece of fabric, fold it doubled over, and play around. Check out your user manual and find your triple straight stitch and see what it looks like, and play around with different lengths to see which one stretches better for you and which one you prefer. So I'm starting on one of the side seams. Look at that. And it's a straight stitch, but you can see that I have not sacrificed the stretch in my fabric, okay? It's still there, but it gives me a nice look of just a nice straight line of stitching. When I come back around to my initial stitches, I'm not going to backstitch. I'm just going to go into the first couple of stitches by a few so that they overlap, and that's enough to secure those stitches in place. All right, so here we have our hem, and I used the white thread so you all can see it, but it really doesn't look bad at all. Remember, triple straight stitch, not a regular straight stitch. A regular straight stitch, if you tug on it like this, it will pop. You can see how much stretch we still have in there, how nicely the hem looks, and no stitches are popped. Okay, so that is a little trick. If you've never tried the triple straight stitch before, give it a try when you go to hem some of your knit garments. So I'm going to press and set with the clapper so everything is nice and flat. And to get a nice hem at the bottom, you really have to be consistent in sewing straight. So if you struggle with keeping consistent seam allowances when you're sewing, the best tip I can give you for that is to place some type of a seam guide to help you stay straight, but also to choose a thread color that is the same color or slightly darker than your fabric. So if there are little bobbles in the hemline here, in the top stitching for the hem, you won't really be able to see them. When you're using a contrasting thread, like I did here, white on this darker rust color, it's definitely going to show up if there are any little parts where I veered off, okay? And I'll do the same thing to the other side. All right, so we have a top here. All we have to do is attach the neckband now. All right, and that is it for video number 6 in my Westchester Dolman top video sew-along. I hope you enjoyed learning my tips and techniques for attaching the sleeve bands and for hemming your top. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up below and go ahead and leave me a comment letting me know what was the most helpful tip that I taught you in this video tutorial. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. We have one more video left in this series where I'm going to show you all the tips I have for prepping and attaching a nice and professional looking neckband. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in that next video.